A year ago, my very good, very old friend, a producer on this show, Steve Bannon, published a book that is basically it's not a reference guide, it's a narrative, but I have since used it as a frequently referred to reference guide for how to understand today's politics and how to understand what's not the same between the two parties. The book is called The Imposters: How Republicans Quit Governing and Seized American Politics. The basic thesis is that the Republican Party is different from the Democratic Party in one very specific way. They are post-policy. Whatever they may have been in the past or whatever they may have been driven by in the past, the key insight you need for understanding them today is that they are not working on policy anymore. They are not working on governing. They're working on power. They're working on messaging. They're working on all sorts of other things that benefit themselves. But governing, policy, running the country, not a functioning dynamic inside their party at all. And a post-policy party uninterested in governing is, of course, a very nice, very empty vessel that can, with shocking ease, be taken over by, say, a demagogue with no goals beyond his own power and ego. Here's a little piece of it. This is actually from a brand new afterword to The Imposters, which is just out today in paperback. Steve says, quote, "Among the hallmarks of post-policy thinking is a rejection of data, evidence, and expertise. In the case of the 2020 presidential election, the data showed Trump losing the race badly. The evidence to the contrary simply didn't exist. Even experts from Trump's own administration rejected the president's utterly ridiculous claims. Indeed, Christopher Krebs, the nation's top cybersecurity official at the Department of Homeland Security, celebrated the fact that the elections were the most secure in American history and were untainted by irregularities. President Trump responded by firing Christopher Krebs for having told the truth. When even Attorney General William Barr said the Justice Department couldn't find evidence of systemic fraud, Trump parted ways with him, too. It would have been awful enough for an American president to borrow the playbook used too often by foreign autocrats. But the calamity was made vastly worse by his party's willingness to endorse Trump's Democratic assault. With limited exceptions, congressional Republicans cheered the president on while he tried to overturn the results of his defeat, unmoved by Trump's apparent madness and the toll it was taking on the integrity of the country's institutions. And of course, that effort has only grown in pace and scope since then. The effort to undermine the results of the 2020 election is now the animating force within the Republican Party, which more than anything is working on rescinding voting rights and seizing partisan control of the administration of elections. And it shows no sign of slowing down, quite the contrary. But here's one other important point Steve makes in his book. And this is part of why I love Steve and have worked with him for so many years, since literally we were kids. At least I think of us as kids. He also writes about the fact that it is not inevitable that the Republicans are a post-policy party. It is a choice they are making, and you can prove it. Steve says, quote, "It would be a mistake to assume Republicans are incapable of effective policymaking. When utilizing gerrymandering techniques to give Republican candidates unfair and undemocratic electoral advantages, for example, Republicans have demonstrated an uncanny ability to carefully utilize evidence in pursuit of substantive goals. In North Carolina, for example, an appeals court found that Republican officials drew legislative district boundaries that targeted black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. It was part of a racist scheme to undermine democracy, but it was also a reminder that when Republicans are willing to set their minds to it, they are able to roll up their sleeves and do substantive work in pursuit of their goals. Their goals are sometimes abhorrent, but the party at least has the capacity, meaning they're numerate, right? They just don't choose to be when it comes to things like bogus election fraud claims. When it comes to drawing maps for electoral advantage, they can be very numerate about that. I mean, from all of these incredibly specific targeted laws being passed in Republican-controlled states, laws aimed at making it harder for certain people to vote and easier for Republican officials to overrule election outcomes they don't like, up to and including tonight's united Republican Senate blockade against even debating a new voting rights bill. Republicans are showing they can set a goal and work toward it. It's just that the only goal they seem to have right now is making it harder to vote and undermining faith in American elections. Joining us now is my friend Steve Bannon, a longtime producer of this program, the editor of Mattoblog.com, and the author of The Imposters: How Republicans Quit Governing and Seized American Politics, which is out today in paperback with a brand new afterword. Steve, congratulations, my friend. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
This is the part where we remind people that you were also the first ever guest on the first ever Rachel Maddow show, where you were sitting in front of a fake bookcase. Now, 13 years down the road, you're still my guest when I need to talk to you, but those are real books and they're at a jaunty angle.
You know, I'm annoyed by the fact that when I look back at that original interview, you look the same and I don't, and that seems terribly unfair.
It's a wig. That's pretty much how I do it. That's my secret. Steve, I want to ask you about what we saw today and that conversation I just had with Senator Klobuchar. Seeing Republican unanimity against even debating the voting rights bill, seeing Senator McConnell define this as something that, a hill he'll die on, that this is not a problem and therefore it needs no solutions and Republicans will entertain nothing on this issue. How does that fit into your broader understanding of what the Republican Party wants and what they're good at?
Well, what they're good at is acquiring and maintaining power. And that is really their only principal focus, their principal goal. And I think today we saw evidence of that. What Democrats did was approach this as a policy matter. They saw a problem in need of solution. They relied on data. They relied on evidence. They turned to experts. And they put together a credible governing solution, the way a governing party should. But what did we see from Republicans? We saw the opposite. We saw them discard the data. We saw them discard the evidence. We saw them focusing on their political goals, their ideological goals. And that's very much in keeping with this post-policy thesis. A governing party would approach this debate entirely differently. And so that asymmetry, where Democrats are approaching it in one way and Democrats and Republicans are approaching it in a post-policy way, that asymmetry is the defining problem in my mind of American politics today.
You and I talked about this idea, this insight into the difference between the parties for a long time before you wrote the book, and we've been talking about it ever since. And now with the new afterword and the paperback version, I feel like the conversation just keeps getting sort of deeper, but we're in the same place that we were. And we still have the same pressing question in terms of what the country needs, which is, what do you do about it? We still don't have a playbook for what to do when one of two major parties in the country gives up on the idea of governing and decides to work, as you say, essentially just on holding power. Do you feel like your understanding of this phenomenon has advanced to the point where you can be prescriptive as to how Democrats should approach combat with their partisan counterparts here, given the differences between the two parties?
I think that some Democratic senators make the same mistake that some voters make, which is that for years we could make the assumption that there were two responsible, mature governing parties. And voters made that decision all the time, assuming that both Democrats and Republicans, despite their differences, had the technocratic wherewithal to solve problems. And the point I try to emphasize in the book is that assumption is badly in need of reexamination, because to assume that Republicans are a governing party is to overlook this radical transformation that we've seen in the party over the course of the last 12 years. And so when I see some Democratic senators, people like West Virginia's Joe Manchin, they make this assumption, they're sticking to this old-fashioned assumption that Republicans are the same as they were. They're not. They've made this transition to being a post-policy party. And by that, I mean they've abandoned the pretense that policymaking, the substance of policymaking matters altogether.
And that means that there's no point in arguing policy with them, essentially. That the field of combat, once they've decided as power only, it has to be power politics, right?
Exactly, right. Right. When Republicans focus exclusively on the acquisition and maintenance of power, and then we have Democratic senators treating them as if they were a member of a governing party, well, that leads to inevitable breakdowns. In fact, we've seen several of those breakdowns just this year on things like the first debate of 2021 on the Democrats' COVID relief package. What did we see from Republicans? A preoccupation with Dr. Seuss in the months that followed on infrastructure, on January 6th Commission, on voting rights. Again and again, the Democrats and Republicans are talking past one another because the parties are not just they're not just offering different answers, they're asking different kinds of questions.
Steve Bannon is a producer on this show. He's the editor of mattoblog.com. There's probably nobody writing on politics in a daily way in the world that has more influence on the way I think about politics than the great Steve Bannon. Steve, congratulations on the paperback. Again, the book is called The Imposters: How Republicans Quit Governing and Seized American Politics. It is out today, paperback edition with a new afterword. Steve, thank you so much for your time tonight, my friend. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much.